A cattleman offered his final portion of food to an injured Apache warrior. When dawn broke, 500 braves knelt in his yard. However, Jeremiah Whitmore was unaware that the dying individual bleeding on his doorstep would transform his entire understanding of adversaries and dignity. The sun blazed mercilessly that day, pounding the parched soil of Jed's homestead like metal striking metal. He emerged to inspect his water containers, maintaining the identical pattern he'd observed for 15 years following Martha's death. The terrain extended infinitely in all directions, interrupted solely by far-off peaks resembling broken fangs against the heavens. Then he spotted the figure. A person lay prone beside his boundary fence, black hair caked with gore, dressed in hide and ornamental work that revealed to Jed all he required to comprehend. An Apache. The individual's torso lifted and dropped in quick, frantic breaths. A streak of red stretched from the fence to his collapsed position, suggesting he dragged himself the final 50 yards through pure determination. Jed's palm moved automatically toward the gun resting beside his entrance. Every homesteader in the region understood the tales. Apache attacks, destroyed settlements, households that vanished during nighttime hours and never returned. The wise choice would be allowing fate to run its course. The secure option would be traveling to the settlement and permitting Sheriff Mackenzie to handle the corpse afterward. Yet something regarding how the individual's digits clawed the earth, struggling for each breath, caused Jed's steps to advance toward him rather than retreat. The Apache appeared no older than 25, Jed noted as he drew nearer, youthful enough to be somebody's child. The gash in his flank was severe, likely from a military blade, and he'd shed sufficient blood to stain the ground below him. His vision fluttered open as Jed's silhouette crossed his features, dark pupils filled with agony, yet no terror. Even while dying, he gazed up at Jed with a dignity that made grown individuals step back. Jed knelt down, near enough to observe the detailed beadwork on the individual's vest, close enough to detect the herbs and flames in his hair. This wasn't merely any Apache fighter. The skill of his garments, the silver armband, the manner he conducted himself even while bleeding toward death. This was someone significant. The youth's mouth moved, creating sounds in a tongue Jed couldn't comprehend, but the intention was evident in his expression. Assist me or allow me to perish with dignity. Your decision. Jed glanced back toward his dwelling, then down at the fighter who ought to have been his foe. Martha's voice resonated in his recollection from all those Sunday services she dragged him to attend. When you aid the smallest of these, you aid me. She'd always excelled at seeing the individual rather than the issue. He reached his conclusion. Jed placed his arms beneath the Apache's shoulders and legs, astonished by his lightness, as if life was already partially departed. The individual's head fell backward, exposing a face that would have been attractive if it weren't gray with approaching death. As Jed transported him toward the cabin, he felt the fighter's blood saturating his shirt, warm and sticky. Yet as he reached his porch, something made him halt. In the distance, barely discernible against the heat waves, he could observe dust formations on the skyline, multiple horsemen moving rapidly. Whether they were military or Apache, Jed couldn't determine. But they were heading this direction, and he'd just made a decision that might cost him everything. Jed kicked open the cabin entrance and placed the Apache on Martha's old sewing table, the same surface where she repaired his garments and treated his injuries from ornery livestock. Now it would serve a function she never could have envisioned. The fighter's breathing grew more shallow, each breath a battle that might be his final one. The dust formations were approaching. Jed could observe them through his window now, perhaps 10 minutes distant. His hands moved without consideration, ripping pieces from one of Martha's old linens. The contradiction wasn't lost on him. Using his deceased wife's fabric to preserve the life of an individual whose tribe were supposedly his enemies. As he pressed the material against the Apache's wound, attempting to halt the bleeding, the fighter's eyes opened once more. This time, there was something different within them: recognition, intelligence, and something resembling amusement. The youth spoke again, this time in fractured English. "You understand what you do?" Jed maintained pressure on the wound. "I understand I'm likely the greatest fool in the territory. My tribe, they arrived for me. I figured as much." Jed glanced toward the window. The horsemen were near enough now that he could distinguish individual animals. 5 of them riding hard. Question is, are they going to thank me or scalp me? The Apache's mouth curved into what might have been a grin if he weren't dying. That depends on who I am. Before Jed could inquire what that meant, the fighter's hand moved to a leather container at his waist. With shaking fingers, he extracted something that made Jed's blood freeze. It was a pendant carved from what appeared to be turquoise and silver, displaying symbols that seemed to dance in the lamplight. Yet it wasn't merely any ornament. Jed had observed drawings of it on wanted notices. This was the symbol of an Apache war chief's offspring. The horsemen were at his fence line now. Jed could hear their animals snorting, could observe the gleam of weapons in the afternoon sun. 5 Apache fighters painted for battle, and they tracked their missing brother directly to his front entrance. "Your name?" Jed said quickly. "What's your name?" "Ayana," the fighter whispered, "son of Chief Nalish." Jed's heart sank. Nalish. Even he'd heard that name whispered in taverns and around fires. The chief who'd united 3 Apache bands. The individual who'd been fighting the cavalry to a standstill for 2 years. And Jed had just invited his wounded son into his home. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. Jed moved toward his rifle, then stopped. 5 armed fighters against 1 cattleman with an old Springfield. That wasn't a battle. That was suicide. Instead, he did something that contradicted every survival instinct he developed in 15 years of frontier existence. He opened his door and stepped onto the porch, hands visible and empty. The Apache fighters pulled up 20 yards from his cabin, close enough that Jed could observe the war paint on their faces, close enough to count the weapons each individual carried. The leader was older, maybe 40, with scars that told stories of battles Jed didn't want to imagine. His eyes swept over Jed, then focused on the cabin behind him. "Where is he?" the leader asked in English that was superior to most cowboys Jed knew. Jed felt perspiration running down his back despite the cool afternoon air. "He's inside. He's hurt badly." "You brought him inside?" "Yes." The fighter's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. The other Apache exchanged glances, hands moving closer to their weapons. Jed realized he'd just confessed to something that could be interpreted as either mercy or capture. It was a simple question, but Jed knew his life hung on the response. He thought of Martha, of the Sunday sermons, of the individual inside who was fighting for every breath. He thought of the choice between being safe and being right. "Because he was dying," Jed said, "and I couldn't watch a man die when I could help." The leader studied him for an extended moment, then dismounted. The other fighters followed suit, and Jed noticed they moved like individuals who'd never known fear. As they approached the porch, the leader's eyes never left Jed's face. "My name is Takakota," he said. "Ayana is my nephew. If he dies because of your help, or if he dies because you delayed our medicine, either way, you die with him." Yet as Takakota reached the porch steps, a voice called out from inside the cabin. Weak but unmistakably alive. Ayana was saying something in Apache, his voice carrying a tone that made all 5 fighters stop in their tracks. Takakota's expression changed. Not softer exactly, but different, more complicated. "What did he say?" Jed asked. Takakota looked at him with something that might have been respect. He said you gave him water from your own cup, and that you used your woman's sacred cloth to bind his wounds. The fighter paused. "He says you treated him like family." Jed felt something shift in the atmosphere between them, like the moment before a storm breaks, but he couldn't tell if it would bring rain or lightning. Takakota stepped into the cabin, and Jed followed, uncertain if he was walking into his salvation or his grave. The other fighters remained outside, but their presence felt like a loaded gun pointed at his back. Inside, Ayana looked even worse than before. His skin had taken on a waxy pallor that Jed recognized from his days in the war. The youth was slipping away, and they all knew it, but his eyes were alert. When he saw his uncle, he spoke rapidly in Apache, his voice gaining strength with urgency. Takakota listened, then knelt beside the table. He examined Jed's rough bandaging work, touched his nephew's forehead, and spoke back in their language. The conversation continued for several minutes, and Jed caught the intensity in their voices, the weight of whatever they were discussing. Finally, Takakota stood and faced Jed. Ayana says you also gave him food. Your last food. Jed glanced at the empty pot on his stove, the one that contained the last of his beans and salt pork. He'd planned to ride to town tomorrow for supplies, but when he saw the Apache's condition, he'd heated the stew and spooned it between the fighter's lips without thinking. Man was starving. Jed said simply, I had food. Seemed obvious. Nothing is obvious between our peoples, Takakota replied. For 50 seasons, your people had taken our land, killed our buffalo, broken every promise. For 50 seasons, my people have fought back, taken your scalps, burned your homes. You should have left him to die. We should kill you for touching him. Jed felt his mouth go dry. But, Takakota continued, Ayana tells me something else. He says when you thought he was unconscious, you spoke to him. You told him about your woman who died. You said she would have wanted you to help any man in need, no matter his blood. The memory returned sharp and clear. Jed had been delirious with exhaustion and worry, talking to the unconscious Apache like he sometimes talked to Martha's grave. He'd forgotten anyone might have been listening. She was better than me, Jed said. Better than most folks. Takakota studied him with those dark, unreadable eyes. Ayana says your woman's spirit still lives in this place. He can feel her approval of what you've done. The fighter paused. This presents complications. Before Jed could ask what kind of complications, a commotion erupted outside, shouts in Apache, the sound of horses moving fast. Takakota was at the window in an instant, and what he saw made him curse in 2 languages. More riders coming, he said grimly, but not ours. Jed looked out and felt his heart sink. 6 men on horseback approaching at a gallop, and he recognized the lead rider even from a distance. Buck Henley, the territory's most notorious Apache hunter, a man who collected bounties on Apache scalps and asked questions never. Takakota, Jed said urgently, you and your men need to get out of here now. But Takakota shook his head. We don't abandon family, and Ayana cannot be moved. Then you're all dead men. Henley doesn't take prisoners. The 2 men looked at each other, enemy and ally in the same breath, united by the impossible situation bearing down on them. Outside, Henley's voice rang out across the yard. Whitmore, we tracked Apache sign to your property. Send them out or we're coming in. Takakota's hand moved to his knife. How long have you known this Henley? Too long, Jed said, and he's not the talking type. Neither am I, Takakota replied, and something in his voice made Jed realize that the real fight hadn't even started yet. Henley's voice cut through the air again, closer now. Whitmore, you've got 30 seconds before we come in shooting. Jed looked at Takakota, then at Ayana, who was trying to sit up despite his wounds. The young Apache's face was determined, but Jed could see he wouldn't last 5 minutes in the fight. There's a root cellar, Jed said quickly to Takakota, under the kitchen floorboards. It's where Martha and I used to hide during tornado season. Your nephew could. No. Ayana's voice was weak but firm. I will not hide while my uncle fights. You'll die if you don't. Jed shot back. Then I'd die with honor. Takakota moved to the window, assessing their options. For Apache fighters outside, outnumbered and caught in the open. Inside, a dying war chief's son who refused to hide. 1 cattleman with limited ammunition, and himself, against 6 men who killed Apache for sport. Whitmore, Henley called out. Last chance. We know they're in there. Jed made a decision that surprised even himself. He grabbed his rifle and headed for the door. What are you doing? Takakota asked. What Martha would have wanted me to do. Jed stepped onto his porch, rifle in hand but pointed down. Henley and his men had formed a semicircle around the cabin, all armed, all eager for violence. Henley himself was exactly what nightmares were made of. Scarred face, dead eyes, and a necklace of Apache scalps around his throat. Buck, Jed called out, keeping his voice steady. No Apache here, just me and my empty cabin. Henley laughed, a sound like breaking glass. We followed their tracks right to your door, Whitmore. Don't insult my intelligence. Tracks could be old, could be from anybody. Could be, but they're not. Henley spurred his horse closer. See, one of my boys has a particular talent for reading sign. Says 5 Apache fighters rode hard to this exact spot not 20 minutes ago. Says they're still here. Jed felt sweat beading on his forehead. Your boy is mistaken. Am I? Henley gestured to one of his men, who dismounted and walked to where the Apache horses had churned up the dirt. Fresh prints, still warm horse droppings. And look here, he held up something that made Jed's stomach drop, an Apache arrow that must have fallen from one of the fighters' quivers. If you were Jed, what would you do? Stand your ground and probably die defending people who were supposed to be your enemies, or step aside and let Henley do what he came to do? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you choose, because what Jed decided next would either save them all or doom everyone in that cabin. Jed looked Henley in the eye and made his choice. Buck, I'm telling you one more time. There's nobody here but me. Henley's expression turned ugly. Then you won't mind if we search the place. Actually, I do mind. This is my property and you're not welcome on it. The bounty hunter's hand moved to his gun. You picking sides, Whitmore? Because if you are, you're picking the wrong one. Behind Jed, he heard the soft sound of the cabin door opening. Takakota stepped out, moving with the fluid grace of a man born to war. He held no weapon, but something about his presence made Henley's men shift uneasily in their saddles. I am Takakota of the Chiricahua, he said, his voice carrying across the yard. I have come for my nephew who lies wounded inside. We seek no fight with you. Henley's laugh was harsh. No fight? You're Apache. Fighting's all you people know. Today we came only for family. Today you die. Henley drew his gun, but as he did, the other Apache fighters emerged from their concealment around the cabin. They positioned themselves perfectly while Jed and Henley talked, turning the bounty hunter's ambush into a trap of their own. The yard fell silent, except for the sound of weapons being cocked and the nervous snorting of horses. 6 against 5. But Jed realized he was standing right in the middle of a powder keg that was about to explode. And inside the cabin, Ayana was trying to get to his feet, despite wounds that should have kept him down. Through the window, Jed could see the young fighter reaching for a rifle that one of his uncle's men had left behind. Whatever happened next, Jed knew there would be no going back to his quiet life of tending cattle and talking to Martha's memory. The standoff stretched like a bowstring about to snap. Henley's eyes darted between the Apache fighters who had him surrounded, calculating odds that were no longer in his favor. But Jed knew the bounty hunter well enough to recognize the look on his face. Buck Henley had never backed down from a fight in his life, even when he should have. You made a mistake, Whitmore, Henley said, his gun still drawn but no longer pointed with confidence. Helping Apache makes you Apache, and we both know what I do to Apache. Before Jed could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. Ayana appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily against the frame but standing upright. Despite his wounds, despite the blood loss, the young fighter carried himself with an authority that made even Henley pause. I am Ayana, son of Chief Nalish, he said, his English clear despite his weakness. And this man, he gestured to Jed, has shown honor that your people have forgotten. Henley's expression changed. Not fear exactly, but a new kind of calculation. Chief Nalish's son would bring a bounty larger than anything he'd ever collected. But he'd also bring the wrath of the most powerful Apache leader in the territory. Well, Henley said slowly, the chief's boy himself. Do you know what you're worth to me, son? Do you know what killing me will cost you? Ayana replied, my father has 300 fighters. They will hunt you to the ends of the earth if harm comes to me. From inside the cabin came the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Ayana swayed, and Jed realized the youth was operating on pure willpower and pride. He was dying on his feet, but he wouldn't show weakness in front of enemies. Takakota spoke rapidly in Apache as Henley and his surviving men rode hard toward town. Kicking up a dust cloud that looked like a brown scar against the sky, an eerie quiet settled over the ranch. Jed looked down at his shoulder where blood was seeping through his shirt, then at Ayana, who was unconscious again, but still breathing. "You're wounded," Takakota said, approaching with something that might have been respect in his voice. "So's your nephew. We should see to him first." "No." The older fighter examined Jed's shoulder with surprisingly gentle hands. "Ayana spoke truly. You have shown honor that creates debts. My people will remember what happened here today." As Takakota cleaned and bound Jed's wound with strips torn from the same sheets they'd used on Ayana, the other Apache fighters stood guard around the cabin. But Jed could see the worry in their faces. Henley would keep his word about returning with the cavalry. And when he did, there would be no talking their way out of it. "How long do we have?" Jed asked. "Henley will ride hard to fort with a story about Apache raiders holding a white cattleman hostage. He'll have 20 cavalry soldiers here by tomorrow night." Takakota finished bandaging Jed's shoulder. "But Ayana cannot be moved." "Not yet." "Then we make our stand here." Takakota studied him. "You understand what you're saying? 20 cavalry soldiers against 5 Apache fighters and 1 wounded cattleman. We will all die." Jed looked through his window at Ayana, who was still unconscious on Martha's quilting table. The youth's breathing was steadier now, but he was far from healed. Maybe, but running would be worse. "Why?" It was a simple question, but Jed found himself thinking of Martha again, of the promises he'd made at her graveside, of the man he'd tried to become since she'd been gone. Because some things matter more than staying alive. Takakota was quiet for a long moment. Then he whistled, a low sound that carried across the yard like a bird call. The other Apache fighters gathered around, and he spoke to them in their language. Whatever he said made them look at Jed with new eyes. "I have told them what you said," Takakota explained, "about some things mattering more than life. It is an Apache way of thinking. What happens now? Now we prepare for war." Takakota looked toward the horizon where the dust from Henley's retreat was still visible. "But first, I must send word to my brother. Chief Nalish must know that his son has found a friend worth dying for." One of the younger fighters mounted his horse and rode out into the gathering dusk, carrying a message that would travel faster than any cavalry patrol. As Jed watched him disappear into the shadows between the hills, he realized that tomorrow would bring either his death or something even more unlikely, the sight of the most feared Apache war chief in the territory riding to the aid of a simple cattleman who'd chosen compassion over fear. But tonight, he had wounded men to tend and a defense to prepare. And somewhere in the darkness, Buck Henley was spinning a story that would bring down the wrath of the entire territorial army. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky the color of old blood. Jed had barely slept, spending the night checking on Ayana and helping Takakota's men prepare defensive positions around the cabin. The young Apache's fever had broken just before sunrise, and his breathing had grown stronger, but he was still too weak to travel. They all heard the horses before they saw them. The sound started as a distant rumble, like thunder rolling across the plains, but it grew steadily louder. Jed stepped onto his porch, rifle in hand, expecting to see Henley riding back with a cavalry patrol. Instead, what he saw made his knees nearly buckle. The horizon was alive with riders, not 20 cavalry soldiers, but hundreds of Apache fighters. Their horses moving like a dark wave across the grassland. At their head rode a figure that could only be Chief Nalish himself. Tall, proud, wearing the war paint and eagle feathers that marked him as one of the most powerful men in the territory. "Jesus," Jed whispered. Takakota emerged from the cabin, took one look at the approaching army, and smiled grimly. "My brother received my message." "How many are there?" "I count nearly 500 fighters from 3 ally bands." Takakota's voice carried a note of awe. "I have never seen so many of our people gathered in one place." The Apache army flowed around Jed's ranch like water around a stone, taking positions that stretched as far as the eye could see. But they didn't approach the cabin itself. Instead, they began a ritual that Jed had never witnessed before. Hundreds of fighters dismounting and kneeling in perfect silence, facing the small building where their chief's son lay recovering. Chief Nalish himself rode forward alone, stopping just short of the porch. He was older than Jed had expected, maybe 50, with silver threading through his black hair and scars that spoke of countless battles. But his eyes held the same dignity Jed had seen in his son. "You are Jeremiah Whitmore," the chief said in English that was precise and formal. "I am. My son lives because of your kindness. Any man would have done the same." Nalish shook his head slowly. "No, any man would have left him to die or killed him for the bounty. You chose a different path." The chief dismounted and approached the porch. "Takakota tells me you were wounded defending my son." "Show me." Jed pulled back his shirt to reveal the bandaged bullet graze on his shoulder. Nalish examined it with the practiced eye of a man who'd seen many battle wounds. "You bled for Apache blood," the chief said. "This creates bonds that cannot be broken." From inside the cabin came the sound of movement. Ayana appeared in the doorway, still pale but standing under his own power. When he saw his father, his face lit up with joy and relief. "Father," he said in English, clearly wanting Jed to understand. "This man saved my life. He gave me his last food, his last water, and put himself in danger to protect me." Chief Nalish turned back to Jed. "My son tells me you spoke of your woman, the one who walks in the spirit world. He says her wisdom guided your actions. Martha always said we should help folks when we can. Didn't matter who they were." The chief nodded slowly. "She was wise, and her wisdom has changed the path of our peoples." He reached into a leather pouch and withdrew a medallion unlike any Jed had ever seen, carved from silver and turquoise, bearing symbols that seemed ancient beyond measure. "This marks you as brother to the Apache nation," Nalish said, placing the medallion around Jed's neck. "Any who harm you harm us. Any who threaten you threaten our children. You are family now, Jeremiah Whitmore, forever." As if on signal, the 500 fighters rose from their kneeling positions and let out a war cry that echoed across the territory. Not a sound of threat, but of celebration and acceptance. Jed looked out to sea of faces, all watching with respect, and felt Martha's presence stronger than he had since the day she died. In the distance, dust clouds marked the approach of Henley's cavalry patrol, but they stopped when they saw the Apache army, recognizing that any attack would mean the start of a war they couldn't win. After a long hesitation, they turned and rode back the way they'd come. Chief Nalish smiled. "Your enemies have decided that discretion served them better than valor today." As the Apache army began to disperse, melting back into the landscape like morning mist, Jed realized that his quiet life was over forever. But in its place, he gained something he'd never expected, a family that stretched across tribal boundaries and a legacy that would outlive them all. Ayana clasped his hand before mounting his horse. "When you need us, we will come. All of us." And as the last of the fighters disappeared into the distance, Jed stood on his porch, wearing the medallion of Apache Brotherhood, knowing that Martha would have been proud of the choice he'd made, the choice to see a man in need instead of an enemy to fear. If you enjoyed the story, consider sending a super chat to help bring more stories like this. Now, click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video now.